Thanks, Molly. So throughout this presentation, you're going to hear me refer to some handouts. I have about a 5-page PDF document that Molly will email out to all of you once the webinar is over. And frankly, that came to be because my spouse, who is also a pastor, said to me, you know, it'd be really great if I had a sheet I could just pull out of my desk to try to kind of figure out if somebody's struggling with anxiety or depression. And so you'll have a sheet with just some general questions you can ask to try and gauge where people are at and what's going on with them. And I believe that handout has 5 sheets. We're also recording this webinar, so you will receive the recorded version of this as well to go back and look at, or, you know, it's 12:30 if you doze off in the middle and you need to catch up with what we went over, you'll have that available to you as well. So Molly, at this point, if you'll go ahead and turn the meeting over to me, and I will do my level best to see if anyone else needs to be let in. If you all will give me one moment, my computer signed me out. And so I'm going to sign back in so that I can get what I need for our meeting. So I am going to share my screen with you all and admit somebody who just popped in. And we're going to go ahead and get started. So if somebody can give me a thumbs up that you all can see my screen. All right, good. All right, well, as you know, since you registered for this, the title of the webinar is Mental Health 101. In seminary, most of us were required to take pastoral care classes, and those actually taught us quite a bit about providing appropriate care, and they may have even introduced some treatment modalities. I think one of the popular ones is still Bowen's family systems theory, but studies continue to suggest that most pastors, when it comes to mental health issues, have about the equivalent of a Psychology 101 class when they graduate from seminary. Now, this is not a bad thing. This is not a critique on the clergy. Actually, what that means is we went to seminary not to be counselors, we went to seminary to be pastors. But at the same time, we're going to encounter, through the levels of trust that we build, people who come to us who want to try to process some of the issues that they're struggling with. And so what that means is we need to exercise some pretty significant care when it comes to mental health issues. And I have a couple of tips for people to keep in mind. When it comes to referrals, I think a good rule of thumb is that if you're unable to help someone resolve their issues in 4 or fewer sessions, and by that I mean 4 one-hour sessions. We all know that sometimes church members will meet with us for a session that stretches on quite a while past that hour time limit. If you're unable to help someone work through their issues in that time, this is when you need to refer them to a counselor. And that means developing a good list of referrals for people. So here are some ways that you can develop that list of referrals. First, ask your family physician or your local school guidance, or I'm sorry, they're no longer called guidance counselors, your local school counselors, who they refer people to when they're struggling with mental health issues. I would definitely ask both for therapists and for psychiatrists that they trust and refer people to. You can also see if there are any mental health professionals in your congregation. Most of them will not meet with church members because that sets up what's called a dual role, that technically we're not to provide counseling for anyone that we're going to encounter on a regular basis in other situations. But if there are mental health care providers in your congregation, then they'll at least hopefully know of others in the area that they trust. Obviously, you can reach out to other clergy to see if your synod office or if the other clergy in the area have developed a list of good referrals. And another good way to get referrals is to use your newsletter or your e-blasts, however you communicate with your congregation. Write an article about the importance of mental health. And in that, say something along the lines of, you know, if you've ever seen a counselor in the area that you think would be a good referral, please let me know, because very likely you're going to have people in your congregation that have had mental health issues, have seen people locally, and they may know of someone that they would gladly lift up as a referral source. One of the things that you're going to want to do as you put together your referrals is do a little bit of research around the practices, not the practices of counseling, but the centers themselves. It's going to be helpful to find out if they only accept direct pay. So for example, here at Water's Edge, we're a direct pay center. That means we do not file with insurance, that when folks come in, we may work a bit on a sliding scale, but generally we say this is how much it costs per hour to meet with this therapist. It's also helpful to find out if they file through insurance, and that may take a little legwork on the part of the person who is trying to find their way to a center. What I would also suggest is that you find out if the center uses a sliding fee scale, and if so, what it is. The first center that I ever did volunteer work in did a great deal of free counseling. The lowest I charged anybody was $10 an hour, which in the therapy world is extraordinarily insignificant. And often when people are paying a bit more for their therapy, they're a bit more invested in moving it forward. One of the things you can do, though, if you have a good relationship with the person who has come to you and said, I would like to have some referrals, is encourage them to sign a release form. Encourage them to speak with their counselor about signing a release form so that the counselor can openly speak with you as their pastor. There's a great deal of benefit in what we would call coordination of care, right? And so if you find out that the counselor is encouraging the person to keep a journal, right? And your church member knows that you have open communication with the counselor. When you're interacting with that person, providing just pastoral care or prayer or support, you can say, hey, by the way, how are you doing with that journal? And that way they're getting the same information from the same people. And one of the biggest things I always like to remind clergy of is making a referral doesn't mean that you've failed. It doesn't mean that you're incapable or that you don't have the skills that are needed. What it means is that you are doing your very best to serve the person who is in need. And so referrals are always good. I do want to talk a little bit about insurance, just so you're prepared to have this conversation with folks. Insurance can be tough. When you file through insurance, your diagnosis is going to follow you for the rest of your life. Some people do not want that. There are some careers where simply having a diagnosis of depression will preclude you from being involved or serving in that career. I am working with a few members of the armed forces that sought me out instead of behavioral health through their branch of the armed forces, because a diagnosis in the armed forces can cause significant issues depending on where you serve. And so let people know that the diagnosis follows them. It's also a good idea to remind them to check to see what their insurance allows. Some limit the number of sessions. Some will say, we only cover 6 sessions, that's all you get. People sometimes assume filing through insurance means the cost is going to be decreased. For some, they're going to find out that they're going to be paying whatever the allowed amount is until they meet their deductible. And it's also a good idea for people to find out what is and isn't covered. The first insurance plan, or the insurance plan that I was a part of when I served as a college chaplain, did not allow for couples therapy or family therapy, only individual. And so letting people know that they may find out that they can't file through their insurance. This one bothers me more than anything else, depending on the insurance plan. Some, if a person sees a family practitioner or a psychiatrist and is given a med, some will say, yep, okay, we will fill that medication. Others go on a tiered system. I've disclosed in these workshops before that I take an antidepressant. The first time that was introduced for me was in 2006. The doctor prescribed what he thought would be right for me, and my insurance company absolutely refused to fill it because it was a second tier drug. They demanded that I try the first tier and then prove that it didn't work before they allowed me to go into the next tier. And so these are things that people might need to know. Speaking of medications, there are numerous types of meds. Trying to give an overview of every type of psychotropic medication and their side effects would be nearly impossible in this setting. And every year we're seeing newer meds come out, or even what they would call cleaned up versions of the other medication. So when it comes to medication, I think the very best practice is for a psychiatrist to prescribe a medication. This is because that is their expertise. The general practitioners have a great deal of topics to keep up with, and so they may not always know what the very best med is. Psychiatrists, though, are tricky, right? Because psychiatrists, some do only med management, which means they say, here, take this medication, and then you check in for only 15 minutes and get charged $350 for them to say, oh, we need to up the dosage, we need to try something new. But when you're talking to church members about medication, some good reminders. Do remind them not to self-medicate. One of the biggest issues with these meds is that, first, most of them take anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks to fully get into our systems. A majority of people who go on medication begin to feel better in less than that time, but that's more linked to the fact that they are actively taking steps to work on their mental health issues, and that just feels good. And so the other thing that happens is people will start taking a med and they'll say, oh, well, it's in my system, I feel great, I can skip it today, or I don't need to take it tomorrow. The biggest issue with these is some of them process out of our bodies very quickly. And so if you're not taking it consistently, you're having a roller coaster of chemicals within your body that it's trying to adjust to. Also, psychotropic meds, you can never just stop taking. The doctor has to step you down from those. Now, one would think that as a counselor, as someone trained as a counselor, that I would know that. When I first went on the medication, I did not know that. And when I shifted to meeting with a psychiatrist instead of a general practitioner, I just stopped taking my med. And for a week, I felt like electricity was shooting out of my fingers and my toes. I can't describe it beyond that. It was just this very weird sensation of something being wrong. And when I told the psychiatrist, she was like, well, you know, that was stupid, because I see a very blunt psychiatrist, and she's like, we've got to step you down. We've got to step you down. And that's one of the biggest challenges with meds, is if you start out on something that's not working, generally you have to step off of it before you step on something else. Also, encourage your church members to carefully monitor how the meds are working for them. And one of the best ways to do this is with people that are significantly close to them. So if they say, well, I think the anti-anxiety medication is working, a good question is, well, what does your spouse think? Are they seeing changes? Also, making sure that they're communicating those very clearly to their doctor, because again, a lot of these meds will start off on the lowest level, and then you'll slowly move up depending on what they want you to take. Alcohol is something to warn people about as well. There are some, particularly antidepressants, that alcohol will blunt the effectiveness of them. And so taking the antidepressant and then having a couple of drinks would be equivalent to not taking the antidepressant at all during that day. And finally, with medication, there are always side effects that people don't always enjoy. Commonly among antidepressants, it's potential for weight gain and inhibiting sexual libido. And those are things that people don't necessarily want to give up. but walking them through these issues, letting them know if they're asking you questions about medications, about the pros and the cons, is a good way to support people as well. And finally, in terms of meds, medications are wonderful. I always recommend talk therapy with psychotropic medications that most people, particularly those with depression, are not going to respond just to the medication. They're going to need that processing time as well. And finally, a good thing to do is just to be completely honest with people that you are working with, and letting them know with therapy, after the first session, people tend to feel great. They have finally found someone they can talk to about what they're experiencing. They're finally telling their story out loud, and it feels good. Now, I'll tell you from my perspective, the first session is what I always call the boring session. And I call it the boring session because I have to spend the first half of it reviewing paperwork that people have signed and then walking through their intake interview. And only the last 10 minutes is tell me what brings you to therapy. And that's where I'm really struggling with depression, I'm really anxious stuff comes out. People feel good after that. After the second session, they may not feel as good. The second session is when we start poking around a little bit in the places that hurt. And it's easy to leave sessions feeling raw and feeling like you feel worse, right? Wait a second, I was feeling better, now I'm feeling worse. And that can extend really into the third and fourth session. And there's this great trend in therapy that a lot of people bail after the second session because it feels bad and they go, well, therapy's not working. See, it's not working for me. But if you can encourage people, just push through those first 2 to 4 sessions, that they're gonna be dealing with painful and uncomfortable things, and just kind of pushing through will help them get to that part where things do start to feel better again. You can also let them know that with therapy, there's never a 100% guarantee of success. However, there are some things that improve likelihood of success. And those would be if they know they have issues, if they're willing to do the work, or if they want to work on them, and if they're willing to do the work. Those 3 things together usually lead to enhanced success in therapy. So although we're going to encounter any number of mental health issues when we serve as a congregation, my goal today is to when we serve a congregation rather, my goal today is to draw attention to a few that you may encounter more often than not. And as we do that, I'm going to share with you the diagnostic criteria from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders 5th edition, the DSM-5. I'm not expecting you to become diagnosers. Instead, these can help you with the questions you can ask. And again, you're going to get handouts with some of those questions. So we're going to start with a quick overview of depression. There are a variety of different diagnoses that we can give in the depression category. The most common we're going to see is major depressive episode. And so for a major depressive episode, you have to have 5 or more of the following symptoms during the same 2-week period, and these have to represent a change in previous functioning, okay? So when we look at that, number 1 or number 2 must be present for a major depression or major depressive episode to be diagnosed. So number 1 is a depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day, as indicated by subjective reports. Subjective reports, people saying, I feel hopeless, I feel empty, I feel sad. Or observation by others. Gosh, you're crying every day, you're tearful. Interestingly enough, instead of a depressed mood, in children, it may manifest as irritability. In men, it may manifest as anger. So if someone is saying you're more angry than you used to be, start looking into the depression, particularly with men. If they're saying my child is irritable, start looking into that. The second one, again, you must have 1 or 2, is diminished pleasure in all or almost all activities. This is the person who says, I used to enjoy crocheting and I just never do it anymore. I used to love going to the gym and I've stopped. We also need to then look for significant weight loss when not dieting, or weight gain that is unexplained. And that would be a change of either an increase or a decrease of 5% of the body weight in 1 month. Another marker of depression will be a decrease in appetite. Watch for insomnia or hypersomnia. Are they sleeping barely at all, or are they sleeping more than would be expected? Psychomotor changes must be observed by others. This is when someone comments that a person's movements have suddenly become much more rapid than they ever were, or much slower than they ever were. Fatigue or loss of energy every day, feelings of worthlessness or inappropriate guilt nearly every day, and a diminished ability to think or concentrate, or indecisiveness nearly every day. And again, this can be subjective or can be observed by others. And finally, recurrent thoughts of death. And we're not talking about fear of dying, but we're talking about recurrent suicidal ideation without a specific plan or a suicide attempt or a specific plan for committing suicide. Again, with major depressive episode, these symptoms must be causing significant distress or impairment in their social, occupational, or other areas of functioning. It cannot be due to the effects of a substance or another medical condition, and it can't better be explained by psychotic disorders. Also, a major depressive episode never has a manic or a hypomanic episode involved with it. So some good questions to ask if someone comes and talks to you and they say that they're feeling depressed is, okay, how long have you been feeling this way? And would you say that you're feeling this way nearly every day? Ask them to describe what they're feeling. Ask them if they've been more tearful lately. Inquire about the activities they enjoy. Are you still participating in activities you enjoy, or are you pulling away from them because you just don't enjoy them anymore? Inquire about their sleep. Specifically, are they sleeping more than usual? Are they sleeping less than usual? How many hours of sleep are they getting at night? How many hours of sleep are they getting during the day? You can ask them if anyone has commented on their movements. These are the psychomotor changes. If they feel tired or fatigued, if they're having those feelings of worthlessness or inappropriate guilt, harder to think, concentrate, make decisions, and if they're thinking about death or suicide. If they are thinking about suicide, ask them what form the suicidal thoughts are taking. We're going to get to that in just a moment. And then if they feel like it's interfering with their life. Also ask them if they've had any moments of excess energy. And by excess energy, we mean that they felt that they could accomplish anything, that they've done something they normally wouldn't do, or if they've engaged in risky behaviors without much thought of consequences. This is the example I always use when I'm asking about excess energy. Have you ever walked into your house at 9 o'clock at night, looked at the kitchen and thought, I need to repaint this kitchen? Run to the store, gotten everything you've got, painted until it was done, went to bed at 4, woke up at 6, and you were ready to go. So giving them some examples of what that might look like. As I mentioned, there are different diagnoses when it comes to depression. And it wouldn't be very helpful to go into those right now because there's also descriptors. Like if someone presents with a major depressive episode, in the clinical notes, I write major depressive episode, single, moderate, first occurrence, right? Something like that. There's all these ways to identify what type of episode it is. What you're going to get in the handout is called the Burns Depression Checklist. This was put together by Dr. David Burns. It has 25 questions and you score each one with a 0 through a 4. 0 is not at all, 1 is somewhat, 2 is moderately, 3 is a lot, and 4 is extremely. And then you add up those scores. A score of 0 to 5 points to no depression being present. A score of 6 to 10 says normal, but maybe a little unhappy. 11 to 25 is mild depression. 16 to 50 is moderate depression, 51 to 75 is severe depression, and 76 to 100 is extreme depression. Burns suggests that anyone with a score higher than 10 would benefit from therapy, and anyone who is having suicidal thoughts should immediately enter therapy. And this makes a nice segue into talking about suicide. When we assess for suicide, there are some factors that increase the likelihood of suicide. And for those, we use the acronym SAD PERSONAS. Sex. Males are more likely than females to commit suicide. Females are more likely to attempt. Age. Adolescents and elderly are at a higher risk for suicide. Depression. Those with depressed symptoms or with a history of depression are more likely to commit suicide. Previous attempts. This is one of the highest risk factors. The more attempts that have been made points to the more likely that they are to attempt again. Ethanol abuse. Always assess for alcohol use. Ask if alcohol is in the home, inquire about the amount and they use and the number of days that they use it. For anyone who's depressed, from a counseling perspective, we strongly discourage alcohol use. Rational thinking loss. Do they have increased impulsivity and irrational thinking? Is there a lack in forward thinking? A way to find out about forward thinking is ask them what their plans are for the weekend. If they can tell you what their plans are, they are engaging in forward thinking. If they cannot even identify what might happen, then they have no capability of forward thinking. Is a support system lacking? A healthy support system decreases likelihood of an attempt. So people who don't feel like they have friends or family available to them. Do they have an organized plan? Ask clients what their plans are, determine if the plan could be completed, and if the plan could lead to death. And no spouse is a marker of an increased risk, as is the availability of lethal means. Determine if the church member has guns in their home. If they do, you need to know guns are the #1 way that people commit suicide. Make sure, even if you have to work with family, that the guns are locked away in a safe without access to the key, that the bullets are locked separately from the guns, that if the guns aren't secure, have family members remove it from the house, and you also need to eliminate all lethal means, including locking medications, taking car keys away, getting rid of alcohol, those types of things. And finally, sickness is another risk, that long-term health concerns or terminal illnesses are risk factors. If someone discloses they're suicidal, ask them what sort of thoughts they're having. Passive thoughts are things like, I wish I were dead. It would be easier if I weren't here. Active thoughts are when they are forming a plan and acquiring the means to carry that plan out. So if they're active, do your best to determine the intent, to have them identify the plan and identify the means. If they are able to outline their plan for you and have the means to carry it out, this is a time to draw in a support network of others. This is a time to contact the emergency room, the local mental health hospital, to call 911, anything you can do to get that person the help they need. If you're meeting with someone and they say, I am not going to harm myself. They say, this is the plan that's coming together, but I promise you I'm not going to harm myself. Make a pact with them. Say, all right, if it's in the morning, I'm going to call you at 4 p.m. today. And I'm going to call you at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. Or if you don't want to give them exact times, I'm going to call you at some point. If I have to leave a message and you don't call me back within 20 minutes, I'm calling the police and asking them to come by and do a well check. Right? So sometimes you can enter into these kind of agreements with people where they will say, okay, I promise you I won't do anything until you call me at 4 p.m. and then we'll talk it through and I'll let you know where I'm at. A good warning sign to watch for is if people suddenly start giving everything away. If suddenly someone is giving away their possessions, and I'm not talking about just a gift here and there, but like everything, that's a good warning sign. And if you are talking with someone with suicidal ideation, document everything. Document everything. and pass on to them the number of the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. They are available 24 hours a day. So when we reviewed the criteria for a major depressive disorder, the information about a manic phase or a hypomanic phase may have jumped out at you. When one of these are present, we start to get to the realm of the bipolar disorders that one can be diagnosed with. I'm not going to go into much detail, but I do want you to at least be aware of what the markers of a manic or hypomanic phase is. The biggest marker is a distinct period of abnormally or persistently elevated, expansive, or irritable mood, and abnormally or persistently increased goal-directed activity or energy. A manic phase has to last 7 days in a row, a hypomanic phase 4 consecutive days. You have to have 3 or more of the following symptoms for if the person is irritable. An inflated self-esteem or grandiosity, a decreased need for sleep, like they're rested after only 3 hours. They're more talkative than usual, like no matter what, they just won't stop talking. They have a flight of ideas or the subjective experience that their thoughts are racing. They're distracted. Their attention is too easily drawn to unimportant or irrelevant external stimuli. And they have an increase in goal-directed activity. This can be social, it can be work, it can be school, it can be sexual activity, or psychomotor agitation, purposeless, non-goal-directed energy, right? Another marker is excessive involvement in activities that have a high potential for painful consequences, unrestrained buying sprees, sexual indiscretions, foolish investments, driving 120 miles down the road because nothing can hurt them. These are all signs of a manic or a hypomanic episode. A manic episode, it's got to be severe enough to cause impairment in functioning or require hospitalization. A hypomanic episode doesn't have to meet that criteria. It also can't be related to effects of substance or a medical condition. There are a couple of unique challenges with bipolar disorder. First, you should know that it's one of the most treatable. Sometimes it takes the right time or a certain length of time to find the right meds. But often people do not want to give up the manic phase because they accomplished so much. I had a friend in college who was diagnosed with bipolar. She did not want to get treatment right away because she'd hit a manic phase and she would wipe out every research paper for that semester in one night. And it was good work and she was done with the semester. And so she didn't want to give that up. But the lifetime risk of suicide for those with bipolar is estimated to be 15 times higher than the general population. And the DSM suggests that bipolar disorder may account for 1/4 of all completed suicides. The other thing that I think it's good to check on this is that if someone is presenting with a major depressive episode, if they have ever had a manic or hypomanic episode, ever, not at the same time, not in conjunction, even one time 10 years ago, the diagnosis is immediately bipolar. And so that's just helpful for people to know in terms of how the diagnosis of bipolar is given. And again, within that, there's bipolar 1, there's bipolar 2, there's it used to be called cyclothymatic disorder, which is not enough for bipolar, but the people are constantly going between the highs of the hypomanic episode and the lows of depression in quick succession. As we wrap up this section, I do want to very, very, very briefly touch back on depression, because I think it's helpful to know that the earlier the onset of depression, the younger one is, the more likely they are to experience it again throughout their lives. And the higher the severity of the first episode increases the likelihood of equally or even more severe episodes in the future. By encouraging people to seek therapy, they're given the tools that they need not only to deal with depression, but also the tools they need to know when the train is coming down the tracks. Because with those tools, a lot of times we can circumvent the severe depressive episode by saying, wait, I'm starting to feel this way. I need to do these things to circumvent how I'm feeling. As clergy and church workers, we're also going to encourage a lot of people struggling with anxiety. As with depression, there are multiple anxiety disorders with which one can be diagnosed. So first, we're going to talk about generalized anxiety disorder. And here are the criteria. A person needs to have excessive anxiety and worry, what we would call apprehensive expectation, occurring more days than not for at least 6 months about a number of activities or events. They need to find it hard to control the worry, and they need to present with 3 or more symptoms. Note that only one of the symptoms is needed in children. Restlessness or feeling like they're keyed up or on edge. They become easily fatigued, difficulty concentrating or their mind going blank, irritability, muscle tension, and sleep disturbance, particularly difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep, or restless, unsatisfying sleep. With general anxiety, the anxiety must cause significant distress in the areas of functioning, social, occupational, or other areas of functioning. It cannot be attributable to the effects of substance or medical condition. Now, maybe one thing that jumped out at you was 6 months. Like, wow, 6 months before we can diagnose with a generalized anxiety disorder. Again, though, it's specific to generalized anxiety. It's safe to say that when people begin to experience any of these markers, they are showing signs of anxiety. And sometimes the challenge is narrowing it down to a specific phobia or anxiety, like social anxiety disorder. So anytime people start to identify them is when we can start to work with them on what they're feeling. You may also encounter someone who's had a panic attack, and they are really concerned about that. You should know that panic attack is not a diagnosable disorder in and of itself. It becomes a disorder when one has persistent concern and worry about having more panic attacks and actively avoids all areas where a previous panic attack has occurred. So what does a panic attack look like? Well, a panic attack is an abrupt surge of intense fear or discomfort that reaches its peak within a few minutes. These can happen from a calm state or from an anxious state. One has had a panic attack when 4 or more of the following are present. They're having palpitations, a pounding heart, or an accelerated heart rate. There's unexplained sweating, unexplained trembling or shaking, unexplained shortness of breath, a feeling that they're choking, unexplained chest pain or discomfort, unexplained nausea or abdominal distress. They feel dizzy, unsteady, lightheaded, or faint. They're having unexplained chills or hot flashes, and they're having unexplained numbness or tingling, and they may have experienced derealization. That's that sense that what's happening isn't real. Like, what's going on? This doesn't feel right. Depersonalization is that sense where you feel like you're floating outside of yourself. You know what's going on. You know you're the one taking certain actions, but it feels like you're watching yourself do it. People who have a panic attack may have had a feeling that they are going crazy or losing control, or they have a fear of dying. One of the most common things we hear when somebody has a panic attack is, at first, I thought I was dying. For any of the bodily symptoms, again, they have to be unexplained. And there may also be culturally specific symptoms, neck soreness, headaches, uncontrollable screaming or crying. These can manifest in certain cultures, but they can't count as one of the 4 required. So again, what you do is you take this information and you use that to ask questions of people who say they're feeling anxious. How long? Are you feeling this way most days? Is the worry out of your control? Are you restless, on edge? Do you tire out? All of these things that we just went through in the DSM diagnosis are good questions to ask people. And as they answer them, it will help you better narrow down if they are having challenges with anxiety. And again, you're going to get these questions on a handout. Here's some fun facts. Oh, sorry, we're a little bit ahead. Here's some fun facts. People diagnosed with depression have a higher likelihood of also experiencing anxiety. So when the first diagnosis is depression, anxiety is likely to be involved as well. People first diagnosed with anxiety don't necessarily have the depression. So it's an odd sort of way that anxiety and depression walk hand in hand. So before we go on to the next topic, I want to talk about some general tips for listening. When somebody comes to you to talk about mental health issues, validate their feelings. It's good to make statements along the way like it is okay for you to feel depressed and anxious. That must be scary for you. What you're feeling is absolutely normal and expected. If they make a statement that you're not sure you want to validate, find a way to validate the emotion. So if somebody says to you, no one likes me one bit, you're not going to validate that by saying, it's okay that no one likes you, right? Instead, what you're going to say is, it sounds like you feel very lonely right now. So again, validating is naming the emotions or asking them, asking a clarifying or making a clarifying statement like it sounds like you feel lonely right now. Mimic their body language. This was new learning for me, particularly their posture. Studies have shown that when a therapist mimics the body language and posture of their clients instantly feel more connected to the therapist and feel like they can trust their therapist. So if somebody crosses their arms in a session, cross your arms. If somebody leans forward, lean forward a little bit. That kind of mimicking can somehow communicate engagement and trust. Clarifying questions are good. Statements like, help me understand, or you said you freaked out. What does it look like when you freak out? Those types of things. Reminding people that they are not alone. Many times people feel lonely in their depression or anxiety. They feel like they are the only person in the whole world who is experiencing these things. And I mean, social media has only heightened that because you feel like hell and you go on Facebook and all your friends just have the best, most perfect lives ever, right? And so people feel lonely or alone. And of course, we're not being dismissive. We're not saying to them, well, lots of people feel that way. Right? What we're saying to them is, it can feel like you're really alone in this. Please know that you're not alone in what you're experiencing. Issues like depression and anxiety are on the rise for a lot of people. Help them reframe their statements, particularly the way they describe themselves. They are not a depressed person or an anxious person. Instead, they are a person who is struggling with depression or anxiety. If I break my arm, nobody goes, you're a broken arm. If I have strep throat, nobody says you're a strep throat. What they say is you're a person who broke his arm, you're a person who has strep throat. Do the same thing with mental health issues. Praise them for telling their story. Praise them for risking coming to talk to somebody else about what they're experiencing, and tell them it shows how strong they are. Normalize therapy. Talk about how beneficial it is. This is also one of the places where you can say, one of my goals is to help you the best way possible. Because I don't have enough training, the best way I can do that is by referring you. Please know I'm still here to support you, to walk with you as your pastor, as the youth director, whatever that may be. And then finally, trust your gut. There are going to be situations where somebody is talking to you and you feel like something is off. Or you need to dig a bit deeper. One thing to watch for is if their affect doesn't match their mood. So if someone is telling you how sad they are about the death of a family member and they are laughing the entire time that they do it, their affect does not match the mood that they're describing for you. If you have a gut feeling of deep discomfort, that can sometimes be your red flag that a more profound issue is at play. Sometimes those who have been diagnosed with personality disorders, we just get this gut sense that something is not, that diagnosis and those behaviors can just kind of throw us off. And that's a good time to jump back to I just don't have the training to help you out. The last piece I'd like to look at today very briefly for you is what some people call complicated grief. Here's the thing, complicated grief is not actually a disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It is listed as something that needs further study. In other words, they are working to get the necessary research and testing done to see if it should be included. So let's first start with differentiating depression from grief. In a major depressive episode, the primary feeling is a persistent depressed mood and an inability to anticipate happiness or pleasure. In grief, the primary feeling is that of emptiness and loss. And the depressed mood in a major depressive episode is persistent, and it's not tied to specific thoughts or preoccupations. The depressed mood in grief usually decreases in intensity and comes in waves and is almost always tied to thoughts and reminders of the deceased. In a major depressive episode, there is misery and pervasive unhappiness. In grief, you will see positive emotions, even moments of humor. The thought content in a major depressive episode is self-critical and pessimistic. The thought content in grief is usually thoughts and memories of the deceased. In depression, it's worthlessness and self-loathing. Self-esteem is usually preserved in grief. The negative self-talk in a major depressive episode is pervasive. Any negative self-talk in grief is generally tied to a little bit of guilt, like, I didn't visit enough. If only I had told them I loved them last time we talked on the phone. We had an argument the day before the person died. In depression, the thoughts about death are about ending one's life because of persistent feelings of being worthless, undeserving of life, or wanting to escape the pain of depression. In grief, thoughts of death are more about being reunited with the loved one. So what is persistent complex bereavement? What most people call complicated grief. Persistent complex bereavement, here's the proposed criteria: that one of the following symptoms must be present for a full 12 months after the death, only 6 months for children. There has to be a persistent yearning or longing for the deceased. In children, that yearning may be expressed through play and behavior, like they play, like they're being separated from and reunited with someone. There has to be, again, one of the following: intense sorrow and emotional pain in response to the death. There has to be a preoccupation with the deceased and a preoccupation with the circumstances of the death. In children, this can be expressed in play or in preoccupation with the possible death of someone else close to them, okay? So if one of those four exists, then we're going to be looking for 6 of the following symptoms. First, we're going to be looking for, we would look at what we call reactive distress and social or identity disruption. Reactive distress is a marked difficulty in accepting the death. That constant disbelief that it's really happened, or emotional numbness over the loss. If they have difficulty with positive reminiscing about the deceased, or if they have extreme bitterness or anger related to the loss. If they are engaging in maladaptive appraisals of themselves in relation to the deceased or the death. In other words, if they are engaging in self-blame. Not, I didn't visit enough, but self-blame, like, I said something mean and they sped off in their car and it's my fault that they had that accident. Or if they are engaging in excessive avoidance of reminders of loss, and that means avoiding all individuals, places, and situations associated with the deceased. In children, it may mean complete avoidance of thoughts and feelings regarding the person who has died. We can also look for social identity disruption. Social identity disruption is a persistent desire to die, to be with the deceased, difficulty trusting others since the death, feeling alone or detached from others since the death, feeling that life is meaningless or empty without the deceased, or the belief that one can't function without the deceased, and confusion about their role in life, or a diminished sense of identity. If they're persistently saying a part of me has died, I no longer know who I am. And difficulty or reluctance to pursue interests since the loss or to make any plans for the future. These disturbances obviously need to be causing significant distress in impairment and in social and occupational and other areas of functioning. And the reaction must be out of proportion to or inconsistent with cultural, religious, or age-appropriate norms. So again, we would look at those good questions, and those good questions simply take the criteria that I just went over and form them into things that you might ask. Now, as we prepare to wrap up and move to questions, there's one more thing I want to share with you. And that's medical conditions. You'll notice that what we covered with the depressive, bipolar, anxiety disorders, that there was always a criteria that it can't be explained by a medical condition or substance. There are medical conditions and there are substances that can mimic mental disorders. When I was in Ohio, a friend of a family that I knew, their 14-year-old son was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And nothing was working for him. They kept doing meds, weren't working, nothing would bring it, like they talk therapy, nothing was connecting. They kept doing tests, and a doctor happened to run a blood test and found out that he was suffering from a tick bite. And when they treated him for that particular infection that he had gotten from the tick bite, all the symptoms went away immediately. So medical conditions can mimic those. If someone is talking to you about what's going on, encourage them to have a full physical and blood work. If people complain to me about it was a sudden onset of symptoms, especially after taking a med, experiencing an injury, I'm going to send them back to the doctor immediately. I also encourage those who have closed head wounds or injuries, concussions, to have an MRI of the brain, because repeated concussions can result in issues that mimic disorders. Okay, so at this point, I want to know what questions you have, and I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see you all as you ask any questions that you might have.
So Todd, I know you touched on this briefly, but I wonder if you can say a little bit more about specifically borderline personality disorder. I've had a couple of parishioners who've eventually landed there, and it was a really difficult time to accompany them as their pastor, because I tended to be their, like, what they focused on in their illness. So, and it was just like, it was a system that I couldn't step myself out of effectively. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I wondered if I should try to do the next one on personality disorders, to delve a little more into what those look like. Borderline personality, really any of the personality disorders. The thing that is going to be most effective is clear boundaries, right? And the problem with something borderline, they'll run up against you and they'll pull back, and they'll run up against you and they'll pull back, right? And usually when they pull back, they're going to pull back with a lot of venom, and you're a terrible person, you're awful, and then the next day they're calling you and telling you how wonderful you are, right? So clear boundaries, right? So when I work with people who have personality disorders, one of the effective tools I've learned is, so I had a client for a while, not here in Ohio, that I would always tell my wife, if I don't call you within 10 minutes of the end of the session, I need you to call the cops, because for 45 minutes he would yell at me. He would yell at me about what an enormous failure I was. And so finally, and I learned this from somebody else, finally one day I challenged him and I said, well, what about this? And he yelled at me. And this is what I went into. I said, so I challenge you and you yell at me. And his response was, fine, I'm just not going to do anything. And I said, so I challenge you and you yell at me and then you shut down. Well, you just tell me what to do. So I challenge you and you yell at me and then you shut down and then you ask me to do the work. And it was just this kind of continued, I'm going to name what you're doing to bring you to a place of calm. It worked the first couple times and then it didn't. And he broke up with me. Because I wasn't Christian enough as a counselor, and I was okay to send him to Jesus, right, to get his counseling at that point. But clear boundaries. So saying things like, I understand that you would like to talk with me. However, if you keep yelling at me, we're going to discontinue the conversation. And when they yell, I told you we're going to discontinue this conversation. Keep repeating your boundaries to them and hold firm to them. That would be the best kind of quick thing I can give. But I'd be glad next time to sort of come and say, okay, let's talk about personality disorders, okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions?
Yes, I would like to know, how do you get the certification to be a counselor? I am a member of a Baptist church, but as far as the COVID-19, we don't have church service anymore. And I have this ministry where I encourage a coach, a mentor, people that are coming home, just getting out of prison. And usually what we were doing was trying to mentor and coach to them, 6 months before they get out of prison. How do I do that now? How do I get the training to be certified? Because all my referrals now are on the phone, or I might send letters out to them, or scriptures or encouraging words or something like that.
So most states are going to say that one cannot use the title of therapist or counselor unless they have completed a master's degree, gotten all the training, and passed. There are several exams that we have to pass once our training is complete. Most counseling master's programs are about 58 to 61 hours, so about 2 years worth of work. They all generally require two 300-hour internships. And then after you, and this is where every state is sort of a challenge. After you've completed the coursework, passed the classes, taken the tests, then you can apply for licensure in the state. And sometimes in Georgia, you have to already be employed at a counseling center. You have to have a supervisor lined up and a place where you're going to be working on your hours. Now, that said, there are a lot of people who do sort of the life coach type thing or mentoring, and there's no requirement there of that kind of, a lot of that comes from life experience or those types of things. What I would say is if it is a profound interest, take advantage of opportunities to learn about different techniques. If you don't think you want to pursue the degree and go through the licensure, then that becomes a really great way to partner with other therapists to say, okay, I want to do some continuum of care. I want to send them for the expertise that you offer as a licensed counselor. But I also want to be in, if they allow it, be in communication to say what sorts of things can we be doing together that will help that person more quickly meet their goals.
Right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, Todd, I've got a question about Stephen Ministry. My congregation is getting Stephen Ministry up and rolling again after having a little bit of break from it. And just for my own clarification, in the past, we've always had a questionnaire on the intake if anyone's going through counseling, mental health type counseling, that that they had to get permission from their therapist and to be a part of that. And I'm wondering if you could talk about the role of a Stephen minister and what most mental health folks kind of think through with, especially issues of depression, since that seemed to be a good chunk of the conversation here today.
Yeah, so I think when Stephen ministry works, it works. And when it doesn't, it doesn't. And what I have sometimes see happen with that program is I have seen it become therapeutic for the Stephen minister and not for the person they're meeting with, right? I think that's one of the dangers, is that people are using that time to work out their own issues. And so I can't speak. I have never been in a congregation. I've been in a congregation that had Stephen ministry that imploded before I arrived because of that type of thing, because it was, it integrated into people helping themselves and people in the Stephen ministry meetings not maintaining confidentiality and jockeying for power. Jockeying to show how great they are. Look, I helped this person in just 4 sessions, and it's taken poor Martha 38 sessions as a Stephen minister to help somebody. So it creates, I think with Stephen ministers pushing again and again and again and again that they are not therapists, and that if they hear anything that is off, particularly in depression, to be ready. I really think, honestly, Russell, for Stephen ministry, it should be the same as the rule of thumb we use as pastors. Like, you know, you're meeting with somebody, you're walking with them through grief. It's pretty typical grief. You're meeting with someone, you're walking with them through sadness or unhappiness. But when the more major issues come up, I think with Stephen ministry, if that's something the person can't talk with them through in about 4 meetings, they need to be referring to someone else. And I think it's wise that you have that in your paperwork, because let me reframe that. I think you should encourage people to do that, because what you're asking them to do is admit to others that they're in therapy, that they have to come back and say, my therapist said this is okay. And that's a little blurring of the lines of confidentiality, right? There are some people who want a person to talk with and pray with who don't want them to know that they're seeking therapy. And so I would put a little bit of caution around that piece. Other questions? Okay, so I'm going to jump back to the screen share here, just to show you all the last slide, which is the commercial. I really want to thank you all for being a part of the webinar today. I hope that you're continuing to find these helpful. If it is helpful for you, I am glad to do presentations or lead workshops for your congregation, for your leadership teams. You can contact me at that todd@watersedgecounseling.com, and we can discuss some specifics around that. But if you're local here in Savannah, I also want you to know that Water's Edge will always gladly take referrals. There's the phone number on our website. You can also like and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and we've just recently set up a YouTube channel where you can watch some of the videos that we've done. Most of you who have been here before already know about Aweber. Aweber is an email listserv that we use. You're going to be invited to be a part of that. We use that to push out educational information. And so you would get a newsletter that says, hey, here's some information on anxiety. And it might just be helpful for you to turn to. I know as employees in the church. We get way more emails than we would like, but I think this one is particularly beneficial. And finally, remember that all of our therapists at Water's Edge are trained and certified in telehealth, which means that for the next 5 years, we can offer counseling for those throughout Georgia. Some of the laws still allow state to state, but if and when the pandemic ends, I expect to see many of those lifted. And so I would worry about starting therapy with someone in, say, North Carolina, and then finding out in 6 weeks that I can't talk to them anymore. So again, thank you so much. Our next webinar is scheduled for Thursday, October the 1st. And because of the great question about borderline personality disorder, I will come ready to talk with you all about personality disorders, which there's a lot out there, and I'm just going to go ahead and give you all fair warning. I mentioned this in my last webinar. When we talk about personality disorders and you start to hear some of the markers of personality disorder, you're going to immediately go, uh-oh, do I have a personality disorder? There's a lot of markers that seem to fit what we ourselves experience. All right, the very last thing I want to do is make sure that there's nothing in the chat that I missed. How do we sign up for the personality disorder webinar? Great question. So what's going to happen is because you are signed up for this event, you will receive via email an invitation to the next one. And it will say, here's how you sign up. It'll be the same sort of Zoom format. Okay?
Okay, great.
Good.
Great.
All right. Let's see. I'm not seeing anything else in the chat, except for Matt Must. Hi, Matt. But if there's any other questions you all have, I'm glad to entertain those. If not.
Where's your physical address in Savannah?
Physical address in Savannah. Oh gosh, Molly, I never can remember.
I'm about an hour from Savannah.
Okay. I can't function without a GPS, so I just know where my car tells me to go.
Hang on 1 second, I'll tell you.
Okay.
I can't remember it off the top of my head either. It is, I know it's
I
on
found
Bull
it.
Street.
It's
you got it.
21. Yeah, it's 2103 Bull Street.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so good to see you all. Since I started by wishing somebody a belated happy birthday, I'll end by wishing Kimmy a happy birthday. So happy birthday, Kimmy. And so good to see you all, and I hope to see you at the next webinar, okay?
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Safe holiday.
Thanks.
Mhm.